Remote audio test. Remote audio test. 1, 2.
Do you have a way to you know all about the mutes and so on?
No. I just turn it. You press and hold, and then press and hold.
That switches it off.
Yeah.
So press one.
Audio test. 1, 2.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a test. Please do not pay attention.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Library of Mistakes, my usual brief introduction. This is a free public library. It's your library. Please come and use it. If you want to use it, you register on our website, which is libraryofmistakes.com. You register, and then you arrange a visit. It's an unmanned library, but we can buzz you in from anywhere in the world. We can get you in. So please come and use the Library of Mistakes. I know there's lots of people from FETI's here. Please encourage all your students to come. If you know any students at university, please encourage them to come. We want to see it as busy as it possibly can be. And if you want to run an event, it's available in the evening for hire. And that's one of the ways we can run a free public library, letting it out in the evenings. We are now venturing into merchandise. So if you'd like to walk around Edinburgh in a Library of Mistakes t-shirt, they are available at the back of the room. The less contentious pencils are also available. So you can have those as well. Wrong pencil. It's a red one. And you can also leave a donation at the back of the room. For those of you who are interested in the subjects we have tonight, you'll find our past lectures are recorded. They're on our YouTube channel. And also we run a podcast. And you can find lots of interesting interviews on the podcast. And of course, the role of all of this is to change the world one mistake at a time. And that's why Martin is here, to help us with that. Now, for those of you who are regulars, you will know that I never usually read out from someone's CV because that's usually, but how can you not? Because I've only had to select some of the best bits from Martin's incredible career. So 1984 to 1988, Assistant Secretary General, UN, and Executive Director of the Interaction Council of Former Heads of State and Government in Vienna, 1992. Initiator and 15-year member of the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, 1995 to 2008. Moderator, International Advisory Board of the Toyota Motor Corporation, 2007 to 2009. Senior Advisor to the Chinese government on climate change, 2008 to 2010. Secretary General of the Club of Rome, 2010 to 2017. Moderator of the Gorbachev High-Level Task Force on Climate Change. More recently, in recent years, Chairman of the Rome Symposium on Climate Change, and currently Chairman of the OECD IIASA Task Force on Systems Thinking, Anticipation and Resilience. So we've never had anybody at the Library of Mistakes quite like Martin before. And all I would highlight, and I said to him in advance, climate change, China, and I think Japan is also incredibly interesting. So we're going to hear hopefully from you on all of those. And the title of your talk is Managing Systemic Challenges, a New Era of World Affairs. Martin, over to you.
Well, you can see that I have to do a balancing act up here. If I get excited, I'm going to fall right off.
Why don't you stand back a bit?
Yeah.
I will not see you topple off.
Okay. All right. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for wasting some of your time here this evening. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to present to you some ideas on how we can respond to the profound changes which are now in progress across the world. Thank you for attending this rapidly organized event. I would quote a French philosopher, if I may, called Blaise Pascal, who wrote to his friend saying, "Forgive me, my dear friend, for sending you such a long letter. I did not have the time to make it short." So when you get bored with it, I'm saying you will understand that I haven't had the time to make it short. I will be speaking in this remarkable library on topics which may seem to be a little off the beaten track of this unique institution. I hope, however, that you will not conclude at the end that it was another mistake to invite me here. I'd like to thank Karen Jones and her colleagues at FETIS and also the managing personalities of this library for arranging this rather unusual event. So let me start by summarizing my argument. Global economic growth has undoubtedly produced enormous progress for hundreds of millions of people in both developed and developing countries. But this progress has been achieved at high environmental cost, and it is now vulnerable to the impacts of environmental degradation and what we suddenly now call global heating. The most fundamental challenge, therefore, to the future of humanity is to restore a safe and productive balance between the economy and nature. And this is also a great opportunity to generate employment, to improve public health, and to assure human well-being and security. In addition, The human, social, economic and financial impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, coupled with the intensifying impacts of climate change, have created a radically new global situation, which is now compounded by the conflict in Ukraine and by major ongoing shifts in the geopolitical landscape. The complexity and dynamic nature of these interconnected economic, environmental, social and security challenges demonstrate that we badly need new ideas, new models and new approaches to policy and organization in order to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. We are in fact at a turning point in human affairs where the long-established ideas of the conventional wisdom are failing. I will make the case that the concepts commonly used in systems analysis, the tools of systems thinking, are essential to understand and therefore to act successfully on the systemic issues of the modern world. In the West, our intellectual tradition and our scientific methodology are largely reductionist. That is to say, we separate complex issues into disciplinary and institutional silos. Our governments, our professions, and our organizations are in consequence defined by sectoral perspectives and responsibilities, and we have exported this intellectual framework across the world. The inadequacy of this approach is becoming increasingly evident when confronted by interconnected systemic challenges, because the links between the issues we face are crucial, even though they do not easily fit into our compartmentalized view of the world. We will not be able to master the multiple crises of the 21st century with the entrenched models and methodologies of the 20th century. As Einstein said, and he's quoted outside as well, it is not the consciousness which created the problems which will solve them. Or as Keynes more directly remarked, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? It is most appropriate that we can today discuss these issues in Edinburgh, which is the cradle of the Scottish Enlightenment, and which has contributed so much to the modern world. And it's also appropriate that this event has been initiated by Fettes College, which underlines the historic tradition of high-quality, accessible education in Scotland. Ladies and gentlemen, what I will do, I will first sketch the constellation of challenges we face in our rapidly changing world. I will then outline the main features of the systems approach and show its immediate relevance to real-world issues. I will then focus more precisely, as an example, on the existential issue of climate change in view of its urgency and importance, and then I will conclude with some suggestions on the way ahead. I look forward to an exchange of views after my presentation on these extensive and complex issues during our discussion. So what are the new challenges in a changing world? The issues confronting the world community today are more intense and more threatening than those we have faced in the past. They are now on an unprecedented scale with global implications. They are evolving very fast. They are essentially interconnected in what has now been termed recently a polycrisis. So it's not one crisis, it's many interrelated crises. And they are systemic, which means that they will behave individually and collectively in what we call non-linear ways. In addition to these intensifying environmental and social challenges, vulnerabilities and imbalances also remain at the core of the world economy and the world financial system. Our present models of economic growth are failing, not only in environmental and social terms, but also in economic terms. In a globalized and interdependent world economic system, they are failing to achieve inclusive, sustainable, and equitable progress for a growing world population. We must understand that we face a future not of steady, predictable trends, such as the simplistic notion of gradual global warming, but one of irreducible uncertainty in which the past is no longer an adequate guide to the future. New policies and rapid action are needed to achieve the structural and behavioral changes in our economic and energy systems and in our values and our behavior, which will drive what we call a just transition to a low-carbon, sustainable economy. And this must be compatible with the realities of the natural world. It is no longer, therefore, a feasible strategy to continue on the present business-as-usual path. And this was pointed out by the Club of Rome 50 years ago. We need to change the trajectory of human progress, and we must change it urgently. The many connected issues have exposed vulnerabilities and deep-seated contradictions in the fabric of our societies and in the entrenched ideas and policies which have dominated and determined the structure and behavior of our societies in recent decades. We are entering now a new era in world affairs, and we must recognize that there is no intrinsic merit in our current path of growth. We can achieve other paths of progress which are more inclusive, more equitable, and more sustainable. The neoliberal economic philosophy, which has been dominant since the early 80s, has been unsettled, first by the East Asian financial crisis of 1997, which you will know all about, and then by the financial crisis of 2008. And as this conventional wisdom has weakened, that allows us the possibility to advance new ideas. A recent analysis by McKinsey makes this point very clearly. Quote, "In this unprecedented new reality, we will witness a dramatic restructuring of the economic and social order in which business and society have traditionally operated. And in the near future, we will see the beginning of discussion and debate about what the next normal could entail and how sharply its contours will diverge from those that previously shaped our lives." On a positive note, there are vast potentials of creativity, knowledge, scientific and technological capacities, accumulated experience, expertise, and resources of all kinds, which could be intelligently deployed to create a more just, stable, and sustainable world. The future is by no means preordained, but it will be determined by our choices and our actions, if, that is, we act in time. But time is running out. In recent months, we have seen some encouraging progress in various international negotiations as the world community struggles to come to terms with these complex and urgent challenges. For example, COP27 on climate achieved an agreement for the first time after years of struggle to establish a climate-related and justice-based fund to provide payments for loss and damage to developing countries. COP15 on biodiversity in December has established the Kunming-Montreal Global Diversity Framework to protect 30% of the planet for nature by 2030, to reform $500 billion per year of environmentally damaging subsidies, and to take urgent action to avert the extinction of species. Thirdly, the Intergovernmental Conference on Marine Biodiversity is now moving towards a high seas treaty aimed at protecting the vast areas which are beyond national jurisdiction by establishing high sea marine protected areas and securing fair access to marine resources. These international agreements are a sign of rising concern, but they remain to be ratified, funded, and implemented. There is a very big difference between an agreement on paper and money in the bank, as again you will know, right? Other major developments to galvanize urgent and transformative action include the US Inflation Reduction Act, which has nothing to do with inflation and everything to do with climate, and it aims to decarbonize the economy and to establish energy security for the United States. The overriding aim of this important legislation is to catalyze a $2 trillion program to transform America's economy. The European Union, in riposte, is also moving in a similar direction towards what is called a Net Zero Industry Act, which should ensure that around 40% of all the green technologies which are needed to meet EU climate and energy targets should be made within the EU by 2030. That is a body blow to the old idea of globalization. As China increases its state support for the green economy, we are in a global race to dominate the green technologies of the future. And besides these international and national efforts, businesses, financial institutions, cities, civil organizations, and citizens themselves are all mobilizing as awareness grows that the future is at risk. Innovation towards a green economy is accelerating as the costs of new and renewable energy fall, electric vehicles are gaining market share, and measures to promote sustainability through incentives, targets, and regulatory measures take hold. For example, in 2022, wind, solar, biomass, and hydro generated around 40% of electricity in the UK. In brief, we have been making gradual progress to break our addiction to fossil fuels, to lower energy costs, and to assure more secure energy supplies. But standing back and look at all of this in a global perspective, economic progress is still provoking devastating and unsustainable environmental costs, coupled with rising levels of inequality within and between nations, while several billion people remain effectively excluded from the benefits and opportunities of progress. As we have seen most recently in the debates at COP27 on loss and damage, it is the poor and the underprivileged who face the most immediate ravages of climate change, although they contribute only marginally to its causes. For example, Africa in its total contributes less than 4% to global CO2 emissions, but Africa is suffering intensely from the impacts of climate. This is an indictment of the values, paradigms, policies, and special interests on which the functioning of the world economy rests, and it underlines the urgent need for new values, policies, strategies, and behavior to lay the foundations for broad well-being and world peace. It is still possible to preserve our civilization and to provide a decent and safe future for our children and for future generations. We do have the knowledge already today, we have the capabilities and the resources, but to achieve this, we must reinvent the economy to move from a fixation on quantitative growth as measured by GDP and to aim for inclusive and qualitative progress. We must achieve a new balance between humanity and nature, and we must secure a sustainable and equitable path for world development, respecting the needs, aspirations, and capabilities of the now 8 billion people on our planet. In effect, we need new ideas and policies to meet the needs and aspirations of a new world. And our leaders must find the courage to overcome the powerful lobbies now obstructing action in the key areas where change is essential to act in the wider interests of humanity. So that is an overview of where we stand. Let me now explain a little bit about the concepts of systems thinking and why they are therefore relevant to understanding and acting on all of the above. So let me turn now to a very brief outline of the systems approach. In my view, an understanding of the concepts, tools, and methods of the systems approach is essential to a proper diagnosis of the systemic problems we face, and thus to a serious assessment of systemic risks and to the prescription of coherent measures for practical action. A coherent systems-based approach to policy offers the prospect of more successful policy outcomes, because our recent policy outcomes have not altogether proved to be very successful. The systems approach is gaining in influence and acceptance. For example, the World Economic Forum, which is not a bleeding heart green or leftist organization, the World Economic Forum in its Global Risks Report states as follows: humanity faces a number of systemic challenges, and global risks are increasingly complex, systemic, and cascading. So our responses must be increasingly connected. We hope our report will focus minds on the need for systems thinking and for new ways of collaborating. So it isn't only me who is selling this idea, it is becoming current in world affairs. It is explicitly in this perspective that in December 2017, the Secretary General of OECD and the Director General of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria signed a memorandum of understanding establishing a strategic partnership. The purpose of this partnership is to tighten links between science and analysis on the one hand, with policy and action on the other, to better address global challenges through the development of systems approaches. The program of work of this strategic partnership is implemented through a joint task force on systems thinking, anticipation, and resilience. And these are three critical aspects of the problems we face, and I have the privilege, or the doubtful privilege, of chairing that particular task force. The initiative is intended to, quote, transform the way we tackle existing and emerging global challenges, to enhance the scientific basis of policy, and to better understand the complexity of the economy and its interactions with other complex systems such as society and the environment. A key objective of our work will be to explain the tools and insights of systems thinking in simple terms. This will enhance the ability of non-experts, including the general public and in many cases policymakers themselves, to understand and anticipate better the risks and opportunities of the systemic challenges and to act effectively in response. Systems thinking offers a coherent, rigorous and balanced approach and proven concept, tools and methods to understand better the behavior of complex dynamic systems. It emerged from operations research during the Second World War. Systems analysis covers a wide diversity of fields, including, for example, control theory and cybernetics, process engineering, modeling, scenario analysis, critical path analysis, the theory of organizations, transport and urban planning, and education for systems leadership. Systems thinking is not simply a means to improve multidisciplinary cross-sectoral research and collaboration. Beyond this, it offers vital insights into systems behavior and how to control complex systems. The field of systems thinking also includes the design and management of processes and institutions and human resource development through education, training, and team building to understand and manage the complex issues of the modern world. Right, we're doing okay. So let me now take all of this relatively theoretical stuff and apply it to the question of climate, which most people here would agree is a rather urgent problem. The relevance of the systems approach becomes even more obvious when we focus specifically on the vital and urgent issue of climate change. The preservation of a relatively stable climate is essential if we are to preserve a stable and peaceful world community and a productive world economy to meet the needs of a growing population and to achieve sustainable world development. As we move from the stable period of the Holocene era into the Anthropocene, we are entering a new era of economic, social, political, and security challenges in which the risk of irreversible destabilization of the global climate, coupled with the destruction of terrestrial and ocean ecosystems and species extinction together, are the issues of our time. As phrased by Frans Timmermans, Vice President of the European Commission, the human-made crisis engulfing the natural world is just as threatening and perhaps even more so than the climate crisis. This insight is not new. It has been explicitly identified since the publication by the Club of Rome in 1972 of Limits to Growth. We are drawing down our natural capital at an unsustainable rate to sustain our excessive consumption. In response to these problems, governments have now engaged in 27 meetings of the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they have established multiple targets and plans and agreements to cut emissions. But over this period, 27 meetings of this group, greenhouse gas emissions have increased by at least 60%. So we're sitting there every year talking about cutting emissions. While we do it, emissions continue to rise. The concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has now reached 418 parts per million, which is far beyond the 350 parts per million which is considered to be safe. The Paris Accord of 2015 decided to limit the rise in global mean temperature to not more than 2 degrees, with an internationally agreed aspiration to remain below 1.5 degrees to avoid the worst climate impacts and to reduce the risk of passing critical tipping points. However, without a dramatic course correction, we remain on a path to a rise of at least 2.4 degrees or more. And there is a 50-50 chance that planetary warming will pass 1.5 degrees within the next 5 years. If I can just give you a slight vignette to make that clear. In 2012, I made a speech in Rio, at Rio +20, in which I said, all the disasters you are seeing from the climate change are the result of a rise of 0.8 degrees Celsius in 2012. And O Globo, which is the largest publication in Brazil, raised the question in the press conference, Mr. Lees, if this is true, why is it not on the front page of every newspaper in the world? Which is a very good and serious question. So the rise in 2012 was 0.8. We are now already between 1.1 and 1.2 since 2012, right? So this is moving very fast, and if we do not act quickly, we're going to be left behind. The International Panel on Climate Change states that carbon emissions must fall by half by 2030, that's in 7 years from now, if we are to avert the worst impacts of climate change. This implies sustained reductions of around 7% a year, reductions of 7% a year. But the highly profitable and subsidized private sector energy corporations and their larger national counterparts like Saudi Arabia continue to project further growth in the production and consumption of fossil fuels for years to come. In this respect, the primary objectives of the fossil fuel producers to maximize profits and shareholder value are in direct contradiction to the goals of humanity to preserve a stable climate. Strong climate action is even more urgent because the interactive dynamic systems which drive the global climate will behave in non-linear ways, both separately and together. There is now intense concern, I would say alarm, in the scientific and expert communities that rising emissions are pushing these complex and delicately balanced systems beyond critical thresholds, triggering what is called positive feedback loops. Not positive because they're good, but positive because they feed on themselves and accelerate the phenomenon. And this will provoke sudden shocks and drive irreversible, what is called runaway climate change beyond human influence. Recent scientific research has identified some 16 of these feedback loops and potential tipping points in the carbon cycle, such as the thawing of permafrost and clathrates in the northern oceans, fires and deforestation in the Amazon, ocean acidification and destabilization of the Gulf Stream. Once such feedbacks are triggered, cutting emissions will have little effect. And these impacts can combine to produce what is now called cascades of interacting consequences. In this perspective, the costs of the low-carbon transition will be immeasurably less than the incalculable costs of inaction or of action further delayed. At COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, governments agreed to aim to achieve what is called net zero emissions by 2050. Countries responsible for about 2/3 of global emissions have now declared their commitments to reach this goal, including China, which has set the goal for 2060. However, this long-term target implicitly assumes that the processes of global warming will proceed over the next 3 decades in a calm and linear manner, and that the gradual ratcheting up of cuts in emissions will therefore lead to a stable and sustainable situation of net zero emissions by 2050. This is, however, a most unlikely outcome. We are already seeing acceleration in the changes in the dynamics of the climate system, and there is absolutely no guarantee that the system will settle in a stable equilibrium state at 1.5 or 2 degrees warmer than today. It is important in studying these challenges to recognize that while the consequences of climate change are environmental and human, the drivers or causes of climate change are rooted in the social and economic values, choices, and behavior of our societies. It follows, therefore, that if we are to act effectively to contain the threats of global heating, we must begin to understand the behavior of the complex dynamic systems which drive the global climate, and also take account of the subtle and powerful linkages between the climate issue, the economy, and other critical fields of policy and research. The transition towards a low-carbon, sustainable economy can, in fact, offer enormous positive opportunities for growth and employment, as set out by OECD and by the Global Commission on Climate and the Economy. Overall, early action to achieve a low-carbon economy will be vastly less costly than inaction or action delayed. As we move towards a low-carbon economy through carbon pricing, disinvestment, regulation, and so forth, the scale of fossil fuel-based stranded assets is growing. This implies, as stressed by Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, and by the governor of the Banque de France, that we risk the build-up of a massive, what's called carbon bubble, of overvalued assets with serious systemic risks to the financial system. This is indeed a substantial financial mistake. This also has major implications for the valuations of the assets and balance sheets of the major oil companies and the producing countries. So in sum, a coherent systems approach is required across the various fields of expertise to clarify and understand these major issues which lie at the interface of the climate, energy, finance, and innovation systems. This will be essential to integrate properly the various facets of policy and to take account of synergies, trade-offs, and dynamic relationships. So I think that gives you some idea of how these issues have to be approached in an integrated, clear systems perspective if we are to understand them. And if we don't understand them, we don't know how to intervene or where or when to improve the situation. So let me now move to the last section you'll be glad to hear, which is lines of action, the way ahead. What can we do about all of this? The overview I have presented of global issues and future prospects demonstrates the need to revise the values, paradigms, and policies on which the functioning of the world economy rests. We must urgently reinvent the economy to move from quantitative growth to qualitative progress if we are to preserve a decent and peaceful future for all in an interdependent world. At present, both national and international policymaking are dominated by economic and financial considerations. Think of the G8. That's where the decisions are made. However, from an integrated systems perspective, which I have tried to explain to you, the economy is now, in fact, a subsystem of the natural systems of the planet on which economic activity depends. To discount resource depletion and environmental impacts as externalities is therefore profoundly mistaken as a basis for policy. It is also counterproductive to discount the longer-term consequences of policy in favor of short-term fixes. Climate threats have reached this present scale and intensity because we have continuously discounted long-term consequences while giving priority to short-term political pressures for over 30 years. We have, in effect, given priority to political feasibility over scientifically demonstrated reality. And we cannot rely on the magic of the marketplace to resolve such profound issues. As Lord Nicholas Stern underlined in the Stern Review in 2006, climate change is a result of the greatest market failure that the world has ever seen. So that has to go on your list. Right? We now have a unique opportunity to reorient growth onto a more equitable, energy and resource efficient, less environmentally devastating path towards green growth and a low-carbon inclusive economy. This is not a plea for zero growth, because the world economy must generate the investments and the resources which will be essential if we are to meet the needs of a growing world population. Such a transformation would bring, as I have said, immense co-benefits. On the other hand, the costs of our failure to act would be incalculable. And the sooner we undertake the transition, the lower the costs will be. As phrased by Richard Attenborough, if we don't take action, the collapse of our civilization and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon. On such strategic issues, the decisions of ministers of economics and of finance on macroeconomic policy and investment will, of course, remain central in national and international efforts to achieve the transition to net zero by 2050 and to limit the impacts of all these multiple crises now threatening the world economy. A stronger integration of analysis, policy formulation and implementation across the fields of economics, climate science and environment is needed to generate new policies for a new era. This has already been achieved in some countries. It is no longer theoretical. For example, in the Netherlands, they have created a Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate to put these two issues closely together. All over the world, new concepts, models, and methodologies are being explored to move beyond GDP so as to meet the concerns and challenges of sustainable and equitable development in the new conditions of the 21st century. And as the center of gravity of the world economy shifts towards Asia, differing views of social and economic policy are gaining in influence. In particular, the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development was established in 1992, and it mobilizes national and international expertise in science and policy across the world to provide regular advice to the leadership of China on strategies and measures to achieve sustainable development. Ladies and gentlemen, over history, ideas about the human condition have evolved through generational change. But for the first time, we are confronted by the need to upgrade our intellectual frameworks, our ideas and our values within a few years if we are to undertake the sustained action which is needed to avert the breakdown of the global systems which underpin our civilization. I will conclude with a few suggestions as to the way ahead and some broad lines of action to manage the systemic challenges which I have outlined. First, economic and finance policies must be framed to respect and include the environmental facets of policy in integrated strategies for sustainable progress. We can thus achieve a more respectful and sustainable relationship between humanity and nature. Secondly, we should identify points of positive leverage where strategic interventions can change the trajectory of progress by tipping the economy towards a sustainable path. We can then establish incentives, disincentives, and targets for investment and mission-oriented research and innovation to accelerate the transition to sustainability. Third, we must build coalitions and public support for strong climate action to challenge the influence of the ideological and commercial interests which obstruct essential change. The failure of governments to act effectively on critical challenges corrodes their credibility, their legitimacy, and trust. Corrective action must engage the full world community and must be founded on climate justice, solidarity, and human rights. Fourth, as a moral and practical imperative, it is in an increasingly multipolar, fragmented world, we must increase the flow of technology, know-how, and finance to the developing countries to support and accelerate their transition and their adaptation to the intensifying threats they will face. This will be essential to consolidate the development gains which they have made over decades, which are now at risk, and will preserve lives, livelihoods, stability, and peace. Fifth, we must enhance public education, both to generate awareness, understanding, and support for the measures necessary to underpin the transition and to adapt our behavior in an all-of-society effort towards sustainability. Let me make one final point. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has repeatedly warned that we are on track to climate catastrophe. We can see, however, seeds of hope. And the world's scientists have clearly warned of the scale, acceleration, and consequences of the impending destabilization of the climate. But this acute sense of urgency and alarm has not penetrated the political decision-making process. If our species, which we arrogantly call Homo sapiens, were actually wise, we would have organized and acted to avoid this situation. But we have reached this dangerous point because we have evaded reality and delayed precautionary action for 30 years. We are now at a critical turning point in human affairs, as was the case following World War I and following World War II. In those days, in spite of deeply rooted tensions and confrontations, world leaders were able to conceive and to implement major transformations of policies and institutions to advance economic progress and to avert the risks of another conflict. We need a similar degree of vision, realism, statesmanship, and institutional innovation to manage the risks and opportunities of this new era in world affairs. And this is especially true because the overarching global challenges are even more critical today. If we fail to contain the climate and ecological crisis, this will be irreversible, and the time we have to do it is indeed very short. Viewed in the perspective of international finance, just to come back to where we are sitting tonight, we must in practice revise the mandates and operations of the major international financial and economic institutions, such as the World Bank and the IMF, to stimulate a flow of resources for climate action commensurate with the urgency of the existential threats to the future of humanity. This would be a means of turning the present crisis into an opportunity to create a better world. It may appear totally unrealistic, but I ask you to consider 4 figures. First, world expenditures on armaments, according to SIPRI, have now reached $2 trillion a year. The United States alone has committed over $1 trillion to the miniaturization and modernization of its nuclear arsenal over the next decade. The IMF calculates that the effective global subsidies to fossil fuels, not subsidies to new and renewable, the subsidies to fossil fuels, amount to over $5 trillion a year in terms of unaccounted costs to public health, society, and the environment. And the fact that governments were able to mobilize over $6 trillion in 3 years in their response to the COVID-19 pandemic, that gives you an idea of what we can do if we choose to do it. In comparison, after years of negotiation, the world community has not yet found a promised $100 billion per year to support the developing countries in their desperate efforts to adapt to the impacts of climate change, which are now inevitable, but for which they are not responsible. Let me close by quoting former Chancellor Angela Merkel in her final New Year's address to the German public. She said, "We need now more than ever the courage to think in new ways, the strength to leave well-trodden paths, the readiness to venture into new territories, and the resolve to act more quickly. It is essential to do so if a good life on this planet is to be possible for today's young people and for those who come after them." It is, in my view, an important challenge to the long-established economic and expert communities here in Edinburgh and beyond to begin the difficult process of establishing a new framework for policy and social mobilization to achieve a just transition to a safe and sustainable and peaceful world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Martin, this library was opened by Lord Darling. He told us about the collapse of the global banking system, and I thought that was going to be the most sobering talk we ever had at the Library Mistakes. By far and away, you have trumped that.
No, I don't accept trumped.
Okay. Fair point. You raised some of the biggest questions. Let me start with the biggest one. You're an expert on systems. Which system of government is best set to make this change? Democracy or dictatorship? I mean, we're talking about the biggest possible thing here. So which system can deliver that? You pointed out our failure for 30 years. It's a failure for the developed world of democracy. So which system of government is going to achieve this?
Systems of government are designed by people to suit themselves. So the values on which governments are created are different in different countries of the world. I know China very well. The notion that you can simply democratize China was always a frivolous idea. They have their 4,000-year history, quite a different perception of how things should be done. Having said that, your question is absolutely fundamental. There are democracies which are capable of taking decisions in a longer-term perspective. If you take the case of a country like Sweden or Norway, They are fully functioning democracies. They disagree with themselves all the time, but they have a number of basic premises which guide the evolution of the country. So there is no intrinsic reason why democracies could not act on these questions. We have in the UK joint committees in the House of Commons, for example, where people work on science policy together, Labour and Conservative, on the grounds there's no need to politicise science policy. So these select committees can work together quite effectively to develop a long-term picture. However, our democracies are not actually functioning very well. It may not simply be the problem of democracy against dictatorship or autocracy. It may be, does my system function as it could? And I won't make rude remarks about the UK government, but what I will say is if you look at the United States, you discover that democracy is not functioning in any way as it was intended. Let me give you another vignette to move from theory to practice. One of the top climate scientists in the world is called Professor Jim Hansen. He was the one who first went to Congress in, God knows, 1970-something, and told the Congress they should wake up and start worrying about climate change. That's long ago. He's the top analyst on these questions. And I had him to make a keynote speech at the anniversary of the Club of Rome in Amsterdam. And he made a brilliant speech explaining all the problems. And so after he'd finished his speech, I said, Jim, tell me, you've made a wonderful speech. What's the solution? He said, that's the easiest part. 3 words is all you need to know. Campaign, finance, reform. Think about it. If you have senators and congressmen who rely on fossil fuel money to compete to become senators and congressmen, they are not about to support the Waxman-Markey Act or anything else related to climate. So we live in a system where the special influences are known and visible and act very hard to obstruct 2 things: progress on the issue and to prevent the public understanding the nature of the issue. And if you don't believe me, you can see very clearly now, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, that Exxon in those days, scientists understood perfectly since the 60s what would happen if they carried on burning fossil fuels. Their graphs of the evolution of concentrations in the atmosphere today look absolutely perfect. They're really on the right track. And yet they spent hundreds of millions of dollars saying no connection between humans and climate change. Don't worry about it. It will be fine. We know what we're doing and so forth. So so long as you have in a democracy these pressures which operate freely to prevent progress and to block public understanding, the democracy is not going to function very well. So my answer to your question is, if democracy could be cleaned up to the point that people are genuinely representing the will of the people, which is now clearly in favor of climate action, then democracies are fine.
So let's be positive. We have these overmighty citizens. That's one phrase we can use for the corporations, overmighty citizens. The history, particularly of the US, is it's been quite good at breaking them up in the past. If we go back to I have a chart of the total actions taken by the Federal Trade Commission to break up companies. The most active president to do this was actually Eisenhower, who was a Republican, a very different Republican from the Republicans we have today. Is part of the answer to make these citizens less, I think you've already said this, but making them smaller is an honorable tradition in America. It's a tradition not of Alexander Hamilton, but of Thomas Jefferson, and is one of the routes to make these corporations less big and therefore less powerful.
I believe I'm right in saying that Roosevelt took very strong action against banks and corporations.
Both Roosevelts.
And when he was told, they will hate you, he literally said, I welcome their hatred. Because he saw the need, for the sake of the people of the United States, to take this action on. So there have been brave politicians where the constellation permitted them to take such action. You mentioned Eisenhower. What people may not know is that in his closing message to the United States people, he talked of something called the military-industrial complex, What people don't know was that until about half an hour before he made his speech, it said the congressional military industrial complex, and a wise advisor said, if you do that, you're in real trouble, so they removed congressional. But Eisenhower, as a military commander, understood perfectly well the difficulties of solving these problems through the complex processes of democracy. What I would say is, whether it's encouraging or not, I don't know. We are going to have to face these problems one day or the other. We're going to solve the climate problem either because we turn out to be in the last minute intelligent and effective, and we use reason and intelligence to identify and solve the problem, or we will solve the problem because the problems will become so acute that the public will simply demand immediate change. The problem with that is, from a scientific point of view, by the time the public wakes up and presses you for this immediate change, it's too late to do anything about it. And as you are interested in the financial side, let me say one last thing. It's interesting to make the distinction between a financial crisis and the climate crisis. We've had financial crises, as a sheer guess, roughly every 8 years. You know that from the bar chart. When we have a financial crisis, we think this is terrible, but we know that in due course we will come through it, we will get back on track, and we will continue. The climate crisis is radically different. So is the 6th extinction of species, which we are provoking right now. Once you've done it, you can't get another chance. So this is why it is so urgent to get people to wake up to this challenge and act. And one way or the other, the problem will be solved, but let's hope it's solved by intelligence and reason, not simply by let us say, unreason.
This functional democracy has produced the Inflation Reduction Act. I think you're going to tell us it's just simply not enough. Is that what you're going to say? Do you see anything in it that says this is a turning point? It could accelerate. It did pass Congress. Is there something in the Inflation Reduction Act that gives us hope that the world of politics is changing?
The short answer is yes. There are elements in the Inflation Reduction Act which we must respect and say, after a very difficult problem of the whole Democratic Party against one Senator Manchin, right? If you remember the whole drama, they did arrive at something less dramatic than it could have been, but nevertheless very important. I don't have my figures in front of me, but roughly they're talking of, I forget, 300 or 400 billion in this act of resources available, mostly through incentives, which is an interesting idea. But that is over 10 years. And it boils down to roughly 40 billion a year if you divide 400 by 10. That is a tiny, tiny percentage, less than 1% by far, of the GDP of the United States over that same period, right? So this is still a marginal effort, but it is a clever act, and it is, I think I mentioned, and I would repeat it, the plan is that through this catalytic act, they will generate something like $2 trillion from all sources to shift the American economy onto a different track. We must respect that. That's a serious contribution. The problem you face, regrettably, is it has very little to do with the problem anymore, because we were at the root of this problem for centuries. We have pumped gases into the atmosphere several hundred years. If you look at a pie chart of historic emissions, UK, US, we're the bad guys. If you look at current, it's China, with India catching up, right? China is now burning over half the coal burnt in the world, right? So if we improve our performance by a marginal amount with vast investment, it's nothing like as effective as using the same resources somewhere else, where you get a far bigger, as they say, bigger bang for the buck. It's cost effectiveness that matters. If we help the developing countries to tackle this problem, we will get far more reduction in emissions than if we try to improve our performance, which is already not so bad.
One word missing from the presentation was nuclear. Is that part of the answer or not?
As I said somewhere else, it's hard to be an expert on everything. No, nuclear is a fundamental part of it, not so much because nuclear power is a major contributor to energy production. It's a few percent. New and renewables are now maybe 4 or 5% of total energy production. Coal is still something around 85%, well, sorry, fossil fuels. So when you look at it like that, you see that even though new and renewables are accelerating incredibly fast, they've still a long way to go before they become a major part of the solution to this problem. To get into the nuclear debate gets into lots of very interesting stuff. One possibility is what you would call probably now miniaturized nuclear power plants. That's one point. The second point, which is important if you think about Chernobyl, that generation of nuclear power was basically unstable. A power plant was basically unstable unless you worked continuously to keep it stable. That means if you ran into problems with your energy supply, the thing would become unstable, viz. Fukushima, right? The new generation of nuclear is exactly the opposite. That is to say, these are plants which are basically stable unless you do something to make them produce. So nuclear could very well be part of the solution, but for many parts of the world, you do not need what is called large point sources of energy. You don't have a grid. You haven't invested in your grid, so you don't want large things somewhere. And also, I would say, especially to our friends, the British, that nuclear power plants always finish up costing around twice what you thought they would, and they generally take twice as long before they're built. So your question is, how many $1 billion am I going to sink in one nuclear power plant, and what could I do to reduce this problem if I put that same $20 billion into something else?
I think these mini nuclear reactions...
You're making me work very hard here.
Well, yeah, we've not even started yet, because the audience is going to ask you even harder questions. But I think someone told me that a mini nuclear reactor, not to do with approvals, but just from cutting turf to production is 3 years on one of these Rolls-Royce mini nuclear reactors.
Yes, it's much, much quicker when they're small plants, but you're building some fairly big ones. And may I say, I think the French have something to do with it. And they used to have Chinese financing, I think.
Yeah, they used to. Yeah.
That's a curious notion.
Okay, I could ask questions all night, but the audience is here key to ask questions. And David has the microphone, so if you can just wait until David gets to you, because we are being live streamed, we'd like to hear the question.
Thanks very much, Martin.
Yes,
massively insightful talk, so thank you very much. Alexander Holt, Scottish Government. And so,
Scottish Government?
Yes.
Oh, great. Welcome.
Thank you. Having attended the chaos of COP26 and COP27, and we look ahead to COP28 in UAE, I'm interested about this drive, obviously, towards net zero. There's an element that actually isn't being really talked about yet, and that is, as we move towards electrification, electric vehicles, we're obviously going to need a fair bit of rare metals to produce that.
Oh, yes.
That has implications, one, on mining. What's our ability to turn these on in the next 10 years, set against targets, but set against the backdrop of China's 95% grip on rare earth. How do you see that playing out in the context of US versus China relations?
Oh, boy. You're absolutely right, and there have been recently very interesting research studies. If you give me your card, I'll try and find one and send you it, exactly on this question about how green is green transport, or how green is green energy. Because in order to produce these miraculous green solutions to suit us in our economies in the West, there are environmentally devastating consequences in some of the developing countries where these rare earths are produced. As regards I wouldn't quite say monopoly, but close, of China on some of these rare earths, the obvious conclusion is we must try as fast as we can to find alternative sources, which is what's actually going on. And people are vigorously searching, and they're actually finding new sources of these rare earths. But when we talk about rare earths, some of them are incredibly rare and unique. It's not just a few things. There are all sorts of very fine chemical compounds of different types. So it's a huge new area. And it raises the question of how realistic is it to imagine a world economy where we separate out into different blocks, because it can't work. If, as you say, China is sitting on 90% of rare earths, how are we going to produce what we wish to produce? So ultimately, there's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of drama, but under the surface, the people who actually understand these questions are keeping the system functioning. And although people like to insult and attack China at the moment, they're nevertheless doing business with China. And I don't think that's going to change, frankly. But you're quite right in the premise that our simplistic notion that we can green everything is limited by our ability to find these rare earths to make it happen. The basic windmills that you see everywhere, the white ones, their motors only function because we've got certain level of rare earths. So the more we build of it, the more difficult this problem becomes.
Okay. Good question. Just that, Mike.
Thank you. John Talbot from Fettes College Geography Department. The historical growth, as I understand it, your thesis is at the cost of the environment, and future growth may be founded on new technologies and renewable energy. And with the growth in the global green economy, innovative solutions, countries like India and China leading the way, that raises some questions for us in terms of human rights and how we square that circle, because that may involve active cooperation with countries that we have strong views about their human rights. What's your take on that and how we square that circle?
Well, I think it's extremely difficult to do that, and policies in the real world are a balancing act between exactly these conflicting national interests and the wish to promote much different global value systems. I don't think there's any quick and slick answer to that very important question. I've worked with China since 1980 and seen it evolve. For a long time, it looked very hopeful in the way that it was headed, and in recent years, it's become very different. The China I knew is no longer the China of today. It's equally the same on the other side, that there are interests in some major countries which find confrontation with China to be something which is not altogether unwished for. So I don't see, frankly, a quick and simple answer to that problem. I think the whole balance of the world economy is shifting incredibly fast. Asia is coming up very fast. The scale of China's investment in education, technology, innovation of all kinds is changing the balance of the world, and this problem is going to become increasingly difficult. But I don't have a quick answer for you, I'm afraid, on that question.
Right at the back, David, there's a question.
Malcolm Oliver. That actually puts another thought into my mind, that we're talking with climate change at something which is it's going to affect my grandchildren far more than it'll affect me, even if I live to be 100. Isn't there a huge responsibility to get better understanding in the future, the people who in future will drive democracy? That's the people at school at the moment in these critical issues. One of the huge problems, and I'm a scientist by training, one of the huge problems, frustrations I find, is how few politicians in this country seem to have any understanding of scientific principles, other than they vaguely remember from when they did standard grade science at the age of 15 or 16. Surely we've got to look to the future and get a much better understanding coming through. So at least in 10 or 15 years' time, we're going to have a significant proportion of the people who will be voting for and perhaps taking these important roles who understand what they're talking about.
Well, I've just had the privilege today of discussing precisely that question with the head of FETIS. That's why we're here, because I think you're dead right in part of it and dead wrong in another part of it. You're dead right in the idea that we must educate young people and even older people to understand these issues. And I think that's absolutely right. But one thing I would say is this problem is not, I think you're wrong, if I may say so, is to think that this is a problem down the road which will affect people in 15, 20, 100 years. This is a problem which is now impacting hundreds of millions of people across the world today. We are privileged. We're sitting here comfortably, but that's not the natural state of many millions of people. If you look what happened in Pakistan and other countries, you can't escape the fact that climate change is here right now. You can argue about how much of what is happening in terms of extreme weather events is due to climate change, but even there is now a science which has emerged in the last 10 years called attribution science, where people are getting clever enough to say this proportion of this phenomenon is the result of climate change, or this frequency of what used to be a 1,000-year flood and is now a 10-year flood, this is due to climate change. So we're learning an awful lot about it. And what we are seeing is that if we do not get a grip of this problem, let us say optimistically, within the next 10 years, we've lost it. And you don't have to believe me, you can read your newspapers. Everybody's beginning to say that. So our children will definitely see the consequences of this problem. And in fact, many of our children are aware of that and quite depressed about it because it's a very serious threat to the future of their own lives. And this is the first generation of young people who are confronted by the fact that there is a deadline to solve these problems. So I think you're absolutely right about education. And just to finish, I've spent, 30 or 40 years trying to educate policymakers on these questions of science. And the fact that we've set up this partnership between OECD and YASA is precisely, as I said, to strengthen the relation between science and policy. But what you find is that most policymakers, including those that you met at the COPs, who are sitting in this large room negotiating paragraph 19, right? They don't understand the science of climate change, most of them. And it's because they don't understand the system science that they don't understand the risks, and therefore they're less worried than they should be about the time we have available to resolve the problem.
I think the great Scottish philosopher Billy Connolly had something to say about this. He said, the desire to run for public office should forever bar you from running for public office. Sorry, there's someone from the Scottish government here. I shouldn't have said that. So,
wasn't it Groucho Marx who said, I would not wish to become a member of a club which would accept me?
Yes, that's right. Right, well, we could trade these quotes all night. My favourite one, because I've got, as you imagine, collect lots of quotes about mistakes. Henry Ford. The only bad mistake is the one you don't learn from. So tonight, Martin, you've outlined what you say is the biggest mistake we've ever made. You've also outlined some solutions and the way forward. Not easy, political solutions, but solutions nonetheless. And I think everybody here would like to join me in thanking you for that.
Thank you very much.
So we have drinks. You're welcome to stay and join us for a drink. And Martin will be here for a bit, I think. You can have a conversation with him. And if you haven't actually registered for the Library of Mistakes, once you register, you'll be invited to these talks. We do about 12 of them a year. So thank you very much. And thank you for helping us change the world one mistake at a time.